The knock on my door wasn't a surprise. I had been dreading it for weeks. When I opened it, there she was, my sister, bags in hand, grinning like she'd already won. I had told her no a dozen times, but clearly, she had decided that no wasn't an option. The knock on my door wasn't a surprise. I had been dreading it for weeks. When I opened it, there she was, my sister, bags in hand, grinning like she'd already won. I had told her no a dozen times, but clearly, she had decided that no wasn't an option. "You're really doing this, huh?" I sighed, stepping aside as she marched in like she owned the place. "Obviously," she said, dropping her suitcase in the middle of my living room. "Come on, you'll barely notice me." That was a lie. Within the first week, my once quiet apartment had turned into a battleground. She left her textbooks everywhere, played music late at night, and somehow managed to use every single dish without washing a single one. My fridge emptied at an alarming rate. "I don't get how one person eats this much," I grumbled one evening, staring at the almost empty shelves. "I'm growing," she said with a smirk, grabbing the last yogurt before I could. I wanted to be mad. I was mad. But there was something about the way she filled the space with her energy, her laughter, the way she talked about her classes with so much excitement. The silence I had once treasured now felt different. Maybe even a little too empty when she wasn't around. And then one day, just like that, she was gone. She found her own place, packed up her things, and left with the same determined grin she had arrived with. The apartment was mine again, quiet just the way I liked it. Or at least that's what I thought. Until I caught myself waiting for the sound of her key in the door. Missing the mess, the noise, the presence of family I hadn't realized I needed. Days passed, then weeks. At first, I relished the regained silence. No blaring music, no disappearing food, no unexpected messes. But something felt off. The apartment was too still. Dinner felt emptier without her animated stories about classmates and professors. Even the sink, once piled high with her unwashed dishes, looked strangely lonely. I told myself I was just adjusting, but one evening as I stood in the kitchen, staring at the untouched yogurt in the fridge, the same brand she used to steal, I sighed and grabbed my phone. "Me, you alive over there?" Her reply came in seconds. "Sister, barely. Midterms are hell. Send help and snacks." I smirked, shaking my head. Within an hour I was at her new place, armed with bags of groceries. She yanked the door open before I could knock, looking exhausted but still grinning. "You missed me," she teased, grabbing the snacks. "Please don't flatter yourself," I scoffed, stepping inside. But as I looked around her tiny, barely furnished apartment, I realized something. I missed this. I missed her. I stayed for hours helping her unpack, listening to her rant about professors, laughing over inside jokes. When I finally left, the apartment didn't feel so suffocating anymore. Maybe because I knew now that family wasn't about where we lived, but the space we made for each other, no matter where we were. In the following weeks, our roles subtly shifted. When she lived with me, I had been the reluctant guardian, the grumpy older sibling forced to share my space. But now, as I visited her new place more and more often, always under the excuse of bringing food or helping with something, I found myself stepping into a different role. She didn't need a babysitter. She needed a brother. Someone to listen when she vented about her classes, to proofread her essays at midnight, to remind her to take a break when she got too lost in her studies. And maybe I needed her too. One evening I showed up unannounced, holding 2 takeout boxes. "You again?" she teased, but her eyes lit up as she grabbed the food. "Don't get used to it," I warned, settling onto her couch. She smirked. Too late. That night we ate, laughed, and argued over a ridiculous movie. And when I finally headed home, stepping into my perfectly quiet, perfectly organized apartment, I realized something surprising. Maybe, just maybe, I didn't hate the chaos as much as I thought. Maybe all along I had needed it just as much as she had needed me. The visits became routine. At first I justified them. She needed help, she'd forget to eat properly, she was drowning in assignments. But over time the excuses faded, and I started going over just because I wanted to. One evening after a long day, I found myself knocking on her door without even thinking. "Did I forget we had plans?" she asked, raising an eyebrow as she let me in. "Nope," I said, flopping onto her couch. "Just felt like stopping by." She stared at me for a second, then grinned. "Wow. Who are you? And what have you done with my brother?" I rolled my eyes, stealing the last slice of pizza from the box on her table. You so missed me, she teased, sitting across from me. Shut up, I muttered through a mouthful of food. She laughed, shaking her head. And in that moment I realized how much had changed. I had spent so much time guarding my space, my independence, convinced that letting her in would ruin everything. Instead, it had done the opposite. Somehow, in the middle of all the chaos, I had found something I didn't even know I was missing. Family, connection, a reason to show up, even when I didn't have to. And honestly, I wouldn't trade it for anything. At first, I told myself the visits were just habit, a lingering sense of responsibility after living together. But the truth was harder to ignore. I missed her, missed the noise, the mess, the way she filled up space without even trying. And somehow, without realizing it, my perfectly structured, quiet life had started to feel dull without her chaos. So I kept showing up, sometimes with food, sometimes just to hang out, and she never questioned it, only smirking every time like she had won some unspoken battle between us. One night, after an exhausting day, I found myself at her door again, no excuse prepared, and when she opened it, raising an eyebrow like she knew exactly what I was doing, I just shrugged and walked in. Did I forget we had plans? She asked, amused, and I flopped onto her couch, stealing the last slice of pizza from the box. Nope, just felt like stopping by. She stared at me for a moment, then grinned. Wow. Who are you? And what have you done with my brother? I rolled my eyes but didn't argue. And as we sat there talking, eating, arguing over some ridiculous show she had forced me to watch, I realized how much had changed. I had spent so long guarding my space, believing that solitude was something I needed, something I thrived in, but now, sitting there in her too small apartment, surrounded by the clutter of textbooks, half-eaten snacks, and the unmistakable warmth of family, I knew that I had been wrong. She had barged into my life, ignoring every protest, every boundary, and instead of ruining my peace, she had given it meaning. And as much as I wanted to deny it, I wouldn't trade this for anything. The visits had become so routine that I almost didn't realize when they started feeling less like a habit and more like a necessity. What once was an obligation had turned into something I genuinely looked forward to, something I needed. And then, just like before, things changed again. One evening, I knocked on her door, expecting the usual teasing grin and a sarcastic remark. Instead, the door creaked open slowly, revealing my sister looking exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red. The usual chaos of her apartment, scattered books, half-empty coffee cups, was still there, but something felt off. What's wrong? I asked, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She shook her head, forcing a weak smile. Just a bad day. But I knew her better than that. She never admitted when something was wrong unless it was worse than she could handle. I set down the takeout I had brought, crossing my arms. Talk to me. For a moment she hesitated, chewing on her lip like she was debating whether to let me in. Then finally she exhaled. I failed my midterm. That wasn't what I had expected. My sister, who could ace an exam with barely any sleep and sheer stubbornness, had failed? It happens, I said carefully. You'll make it up. She laughed, but it was hollow. I don't think you get it. This wasn't just any midterm. It was the midterm. The one that could decide if I even passed this class. For the first time in a long time, she looked small, defeated. And it hit me, this wasn't just about a grade. This was about everything she had been working for. The pressure she had been putting on herself. Without thinking, I grabbed the spare blanket from her couch and tossed it over her. Alright, new plan. We wallow for exactly 1 hour. We eat greasy food, watch a terrible movie, and then we figure out how to fix this. She blinked at me. That's your master plan? I shrugged. Got a better one? For the first time that night, she cracked a real smile. Feeny. But I get to pick the movie. It turned out to be the worst movie I had ever seen, but I didn't care. By the time the credits rolled, she looked a little more like herself again. And when she finally passed out, exhausted from stress and emotions, I quietly cleaned up her mess, leaving a note on the table. You got this. And if not, we'll figure it out together. The next morning, she sent me a picture of a new study plan. A fresh cup of coffee in her hand. Round 2, she texted. Thanks for sticking around. I smirked at my phone. Always. The weeks that followed were different. She studied harder, but she also let me in more. The stress didn't disappear overnight, but she didn't carry it alone anymore. I found myself checking in more often, making excuses to bring over dinner, or just to sit with her while she worked. Then one evening, she called me first. "I think I did okay on the retake," she said, voice cautious but hopeful. "I won't know for sure until next week, but I feel better." I grinned. "Of course you did. You put in the work." There was a pause, then a soft, "Thanks, by the way, for everything." I didn't say much, just told her she owed me dinner once she got her passing grade. But as I hung up, I realized something. I wasn't just showing up for her anymore. I was showing up because I wanted to. A week later, she called again, and I could hear the excitement in her voice before she even spoke. "I passed," she said, barely containing her joy. "I actually passed." I felt a grin spread across my face. "Knew you would." She let out a relieved laugh. "Dinner's on me. You picked the place." That night, as we sat across from each other at our favorite diner, something shifted. She wasn't just my little sister who needed my help. She was someone who had worked hard, faced failure, and come out stronger. And I wasn't just her older brother looking out for her. I was someone who had needed this connection just as much as she had. As we clinked our glasses together, I realized that sometimes, the best things in life come from the moments we never planned for. And this was one of them. As time went on, our bond only grew stronger. We made a tradition of our weekly dinners, alternating who paid. We talked about more than just school, about life, dreams, fears. I no longer checked in because I felt obligated. I checked in because I wanted to. One evening, she surprised me with an envelope. "Open it," she urged, practically bouncing in her seat. I pulled out the contents, a letter of acceptance. "I got into my dream internship," she said, eyes shining. "And I wanted you to be the first to know." Pride swelled in my chest. "You earned it." She smiled. "Couldn't have done it without you." I shook my head. "You always had it in you. You just needed to see it for yourself." She laughed, nudging my shoulder. "Still, thanks for showing up." I grinned. "Always." Her internship took her to a different city for the summer, and for the first time in a while, I found myself alone again. But this time, the silence wasn't empty. It was full of memories, of conversations that had changed both of us. Months passed. We visited each other when we could, but life started pulling us in different directions. And yet, no matter how much time passed, we always found our way back to our routine, our late-night conversations, our shared meals. Years later, when she stood at her college graduation, she found me in the crowd and grinned. And in that moment, I knew, no matter where we went, no matter what happened next, we would always be there for each other. Years later, life had taken us in different directions. She had moved to another city for her career, and I had settled into my own routine, my own life. We still kept in touch. Regular calls, the occasional visit. But the days of spontaneous drop-ins and shared takeout dinners felt like a lifetime ago. Then one evening, my phone rang. "Hey," she said, her voice carrying that familiar mix of excitement and nerves. "So, I have some news." I smiled, leaning back in my chair. "Good news or bad news?" "Good, I think," she said. "I got a job offer. A big one. Overseas." I paused, processing her words. "Wow. That's huge." "Yeah," she breathed. "I think I'm gonna take it." A strange mix of pride and sadness settled in my chest. I had always known she would go far, that her determination would take her places I had never even imagined. And yet, the thought of her being so far away made something in me ache. "You should," I said finally. "You've worked so hard for this." She was quiet for a moment. "I'll miss you, you know." I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced a grin. "Please. You'll be too busy taking over the world to miss me." She laughed, but we both knew the truth. Things were about to change again. A few weeks later, I stood in the airport, watching as she balanced her overstuffed carry-on, her eyes bright with excitement. "You sure you packed enough?" I teased. "Probably not," she admitted with a smirk. "But I'll survive." I nodded, shoving my hands into my pockets. "You always do." She looked at me for a long moment, then pulled me into a tight hug. "Thanks," she whispered, "for always showing up." I squeezed her back. "Always." As I watched her disappear through the gate, I felt that familiar quiet settle in around me. But this time, it wasn't lonely. It was full of memories of late-night talks and stolen pizza slices. Of a bond that distance could never break. And I knew, no matter where life took us, we would always find our way back to each other. Months passed, and our calls became less frequent. Not out of neglect, but because life was pulling us both in so many directions. Still, when we did talk, it felt like no time had passed. Then one evening I got a text. "Sister, guess who's coming home for a visit?" A grin spread across my face as I typed back. "Me, you better not be joking." "Sister, would I ever?" "Me, yes. Sister, okay, fair. But not this time. See you soon." The day she arrived, I waited at the airport, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and nostalgia. When she finally emerged from the crowd, her suitcase dragging behind her, she waved, that same familiar grin lighting up her face. "Miss me?" she called. "Not even a little," I lied, pulling her into a hug. She laughed. "Liar." That night we sat at our favorite diner, just like old times, trading stories, catching up on everything we had missed. And as I listened to her talk, I realized something. Distance had changed our routines, but not our bond. Some things like family, like love, never really fade. They just find new ways to exist. As her visit came to an end, we found ourselves at the airport once more. This time I was the one watching her leave, knowing it would be months before we'd see each other again. "Take care of yourself, all right?" I said. She smiled. "You too. And don't forget to actually text me back this time." I smirked. "No promises." She rolled her eyes but pulled me into one last hug. "See you soon." As I walked back to my car, I felt the familiar ache of parting. But this time it wasn't quite so heavy. Because no matter how far she went, I knew she'd always come back. And I'd always be here waiting. Then one evening months later my phone buzzed with a video call. I answered and her face filled the screen, glowing with excitement. "Guess what?" she asked. "What?" I leaned in, intrigued. "I'm coming home for good." My heart skipped a beat. "You serious?" She grinned. "Yeah, the job's great, but I realized something. I miss home. I miss family. And I miss you." For the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of distance lifting. "Well, it's about time." She laughed. "Don't get too excited. I'm still stealing your food." I chuckled. Wouldn't have it any other way. And just like that, the waiting was over. My sister was coming home. When she finally arrived, I met her at the airport just like before. But this time there was no sadness in our goodbye. Only excitement for the future. We drove back together, talking like no time had passed, knowing that whatever came next, we'd face it together. Because family, no matter the distance, always finds its way back home. The weeks that followed were filled with rediscovered routines, weekend breakfasts, late-night movie marathons, spontaneous drives just to escape the city. Life felt whole again, as if a missing piece had finally been put back in place. One evening, as we sat on the balcony watching the city lights, she sighed contentedly. "I forgot how much I missed this." I smiled, raising my glass. "Welcome home, then." She clinked her glass against mine. "For good this time." And as we sat there talking about everything and nothing, I knew that no matter where life took us next, we'd always find our way back to each other. It had been a few months since she moved back, and life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Our weekly dinners were back, the late-night chats, the occasional teasing argument. It all felt like home. But one evening, as we sat on my couch watching a crime documentary she'd insisted on, she suddenly turned to me with a sly grin. "I have an idea," she said. I groaned. "Your ideas are usually dangerous." "Should I be worried?" "Not this time," she said, sitting up straight. "Hear me out. What if we went into business together?" I stared at her, unsure if I'd heard correctly. "Business? You and me? Do you remember how living together went the first time?" "Exactly," she said, pointing a finger at me. "We survived that. If we could get through months of me stealing your food and leaving my books everywhere, we can handle this." I wasn't convinced. "What kind of business are we even talking about?" Her grin widened. "A café. Think about it, your cooking skills, my charm. We'd kill it." I snorted. "My cooking skills? You mean reheating leftovers?" "Don't sell yourself short," she said, elbowing me. You make a mean pasta. Besides, you've always wanted to do something different. Something that doesn't involve spreadsheets and boring office meetings. She wasn't wrong. The idea of working a job I actually enjoyed had been a pipe dream for years. Still, starting a cafe? It was risky. Chaotic. Totally not my style. Why a cafe? I asked, more curious than I wanted to admit. Her eyes lit up, the way they always did when she had a plan brewing. Because it's something we could build together. A place where people can feel at home. Just like we do when we're hanging out. Think about it, good coffee, great food, and an atmosphere that feels like family. It was a compelling pitch, but I wasn't ready to commit just yet. Let me think about it. Take your time, she said, leaning back with a confident smile. But I already know your answer. The leap. A month later, we signed the lease for a small cozy space on the corner of a quiet street. It was nothing fancy. Chipped paint on the walls, a squeaky front door, but it had potential. She saw it immediately, describing her vision in vivid detail. Rustic tables, warm lighting, shelves lined with books and plants. It's perfect, she said, her voice full of hope. You'll see. We spent weeks renovating the space, working late into the night with paint rollers and second-hand furniture. She handled the creative side, choosing the color scheme, picking out quirky decorations, while I focused on the practical stuff. Permits, suppliers, budgeting. It was exhausting, but somehow it didn't feel like work. Not when we were in it together. The first night we stayed until sunrise, collapsing on the floor with paint smudges on our faces and takeout containers scattered around us. She turned to me and said, I think we're actually doing this. I laughed, staring up at the ceiling. Yeah, I think we are. Opening day. The cafe opened on a crisp autumn morning. The sign above the door read Together Cafe. Her idea, of course. The name felt right, though, because that's exactly what it was. A place built together for others to come together. The first few weeks were chaotic. Orders got mixed up, the coffee machine broke twice, and there were moments when I wondered if we'd made a huge mistake. But then I'd see her talking to customers, her laughter filling the space, and I'd remember why we started this in the first place. One evening after we closed up, she sat at one of the tables sipping a latte. You know, she said, I wasn't sure you'd actually go through with this. I smirked, wiping down the counter. Neither was I. She grinned. But aren't you glad you did? I thought about it, the long hours, the challenges, the moments of doubt, and realized she was right. Yeah, I am. A new chapter. Over time, the cafe became more than just a business. It became a hub for the community, a place where people came to work, catch up with friends, or just enjoy a quiet moment with a book. Regulars knew us by name, and every corner of the space carried traces of our efforts, our arguments, our shared dreams. It wasn't always easy. There were days when we drove each other crazy, when the stress of running a business tested the limits of our patience. But no matter how tough it got, we always found our way back to what mattered, each other. One evening, as we closed up shop, she turned to me with a thoughtful expression. You know, she said, I used to think you hated chaos. I do, I said automatically. She laughed. No, you don't. Not anymore. You just needed the right kind of chaos. I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't argue with her. Because she was right. Her chaos had become my comfort. Her energy my anchor. And as we turned off the lights and locked the door, I realized that this cafe, this life we'd built together, was more than I ever could have imagined. Months after the cafe had settled into its groove, things took a turn we didn't see coming. Business was good, better than good, actually. On weekends, the line for coffee and pastry stretched out the door, and we started recognizing more and more familiar faces. But success brought its own challenges. One evening, as I tallied up the day's earnings, my sister walked in, carrying a stack of mail. She tossed it on the counter with a sigh. Another one, she said, holding up a letter stamped with the logo of a big coffee chain. I frowned, tearing it open. It was the third letter we'd gotten in 2 weeks, an offer to buy us out. Generous terms, I read aloud, scanning the paper. Potential for rebranding. What does that even mean? They want to slap their logo on our cafe and get everything we've worked for. Pretty much, she said, dropping into a chair. The rep from their company came in today. Tried to sweet-talk me about how they'd keep the homey vibe while modernizing the menu. She rolled her eyes. It's insulting. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. What did you say to him? I told him we weren't interested. Obviously. Good. But as much as I hated to admit it, the offer left a bad taste in my mouth. Not because I wanted to sell, but because I knew what it meant. The fact that they were targeting us meant they saw us as competition. And big chains didn't like competition. Do you think they'll leave us alone? I asked. Her face darkened. Probably not. Pressure mounts. The letters kept coming. Then came the flyers, discount coupons for the new coffee chain that had opened just 2 blocks away. Suddenly, it felt like we were in a battle we hadn't signed up for. Look at this, my sister said one morning, slapping a flyer on the counter. Buy 1 latte, get 1 free? Free muffins on Tuesdays? How are we supposed to compete with that? We don't, I said firmly. We can't play their game. That's not why people come here. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. I know, but it's frustrating. We've worked so hard for this place, and now they're trying to squash us like we're nothing. We're not nothing, I said, meeting her gaze. We've built something real here. People love this place because it's ours, not some cookie-cutter chain. That's what we have to focus on. She nodded, but the worry didn't leave her eyes. Rallying the community. What we didn't expect was how fiercely our customers would fight for us. When word got out about the big chain's tactics, the response was overwhelming. Regulars started leaving glowing reviews online, posting about us on social media, even organizing support local business events at the cafe. One of our oldest customers, Mrs. Novak, even stood outside on a Saturday morning handing out flyers she'd printed herself. You kids have something special here, she said, handing a flyer to a passing couple. Don't let anyone take that away. I felt a lump in my throat as I watched her. She didn't have to do this, none of them did, but it reminded me why we started this in the first place. The breaking point. Despite the community's support, the pressure didn't let up. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, I found my sister sitting at one of the tables, staring at the cafe's ledger. I've crunched the numbers 3 times, she said quietly. If they keep pulling stunts like this, we won't survive another 6 months. I sat down across from her, the weight of her words settling over me. What are you saying? You want to sell? She shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. No, I don't. But I don't know what else to do. For the first time since we'd started this journey, I felt truly afraid. But then I remembered something she'd said months ago, when we first opened the cafe. This place isn't just a business, she had told me. It's a home. And homes? You didn't give those up without a fight. The comeback. The next morning I woke up with an idea. It was risky, but if there was one thing I'd learned from my sister, it was that sometimes you had to embrace the chaos. What if we doubled down? I said as we prepped for the day. She frowned. What do you mean? Special events. Live music nights. Book readings. Partnering with local artists to showcase their work. Make the cafe more than just a place to grab coffee. Make it an experience. Her eyes lit up, and for the first time in weeks I saw a spark of hope. That's actually a great idea. We got to work immediately, reaching out to local musicians, artists, and writers. The response was incredible. People loved the idea of a space where creativity and community came together. Our first event, a live acoustic performance by a local band, was packed. The cafe was so full we had people spilling out onto the sidewalk. The energy was electric, and for the first time in weeks I felt like we were winning again. A new beginning. Over the next few months, the cafe became a hub for the arts and the heart of the neighborhood. The big chain down the street? It might have had discounts and flashy ads, but it didn't have what we had. A soul. One evening, as we locked up after another successful event, my sister turned to me, her eyes shining. You saved us, you know. I shook my head. We saved us. Together. She smiled, leaning her head against my shoulder. You're not so bad at handling chaos after all. I laughed. Don't get used to it. But deep down I knew the truth. Her chaos had changed me. And this cafe, this dream we'd built together, was proof that sometimes the messiest paths led to the best destinations. And as we walked home under the glow of the streetlights, I realized that no matter what challenges came next, we'd face them the same way we always had together. Years later, The cafe became more than we ever dreamed it could be. It wasn't just ours anymore. It belonged to the community, to the people who filled its tables with laughter, stories, and warmth. On the cafe's 10th anniversary, as we stood in the middle of a bustling room filled with friends, family, and regulars who had become like family, my sister raised a glass to toast. To the chaos that started it all, she said, grinning at me. And to the brother who always showed up, even when he didn't want to. I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help smiling. As I looked around the room, at the walls covered with memories, at the faces that had become a part of our story, I felt a deep sense of pride. She turned to me, her voice softer. We did it, didn't we? I nodded, raising my own glass. Yeah, we really did. And in that moment, I knew that no matter where life took us, the cafe, and the bond we built through it, would always be home. If this video hurt you, don't keep it to yourself. Send it to those who will understand.